AdvoKAYte, holding healthcare accountable. This podcast is my way of sharing what I've learned about the mistakes, the cover-ups, and the ways we can all protect ourselves. We're all in this together. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of AdvoKAYte, holding healthcare accountable. Today, I'm joined once again by my friend, my colleague, and brilliant person, Ann Roberts. Thank you for coming back, Ann.
Thanks for having me, Kay. I really enjoy working with you, and this has been such a great venture.
Well, it is interesting how a friendship has been formed from people who are really traditionally supposed to be at odds with one another. You know, you, an executive in a big healthcare system, me, someone who tends to sue large healthcare systems. How in the world did that happen?
Well, not mine, because we're in different states.
That's true. That probably helped a little bit.
It happened because we have such a passion for patient safety. So
it's true. And, you know, we're going to get to work here in just a minute, but we just got to gabbing because I haven't seen you in like a month.
Right.
And so before they turned the cameras on, we were gabbing about some things. And I want to continue that conversation because you work for a healthcare system out of state that really has a culture of patient safety, that really is engaged in continuous quality improvement. And you're a significant part of that. But I was telling you that yesterday I had lunch with someone in Texas who is the head of one of the largest healthcare systems in Texas. And, you know, me being the nerd that I am and not one for small talk, suffering from terminal seriousness, I asked her, I said, what are we going to do to fix healthcare? And she looked me dead in the eye and she said, we're trying. And it reminded me to remind our listeners that we are not anti-doctor, we're not anti-nurse, we're not anti-all hospitals or all hospital systems. There are people in the healthcare industry who are trying as hard as we are to fix the known problems.
Absolutely. You know, I've been doing this now and working in the field that I'm in for 29 years. And I have worked with the majority of everybody I work with, from physician leaders, of course, who is my primary partners in patient safety, from nursing leaders and administrators. You know, their goal is always to advance quality for patient safety and, you know, focusing on how do we make things better. Like in any industry, any type of profession, you know, you're going to have some bad actors, right? It's just very different when it's related to patient care. We can't have bad actors because it impacts, you know, health. But for the great majority of them, they're truly focused on how do we make things better for patients? How do we advance healthcare in a safe, quality way? So,
you know, it's interesting because there really is a divide between good hospitals and good hospital systems and bad ones, and good doctors and bad doctors, good nurses, bad nurses. But the thing is, sometimes there's good nurses that became bad nurses, good physicians that became bad physicians because life got in their way. You know, financial problems, addiction, mental health, things of that nature. But what we also see a ton of is sometimes the system just beat the hell out of them. And they once cared, but then they got burned out and quit caring. I mean, do you see that?
You know, I think we have seen that in some of the cases, of course, throughout my career. I think that, like anybody, you know, any individual, you know, life happens, things get in the way, you know, curveballs are thrown at you. Something I tell my son all the time, you can't plan for everything. And once you think you've got this plan down, there's going to be a curveball.
Right.
And so I think that you're absolutely right. There's going to be individuals who may have had a great career and something threw a curveball at them, and then they may have gone, you know, the other direction. But like I said, I think that can happen in all walks of life. So
it can happen in all walks of life, and it can happen to the bus driver that's driving a busload full of children, and it can happen to somebody that's holding a scalpel in their hand operating on your spinal cord or near your spinal cord. But there are systems in place to, as a safety net for patients, to monitor for these things and catch these things before they hurt people. And I think you and I can agree that this is what we're focusing on, is that it's not a whole bunch of different problems.
Right.
Primarily, it's a smaller set of problems that keep occurring and reoccurring and reoccurring.
I agree.
But for reasons that neither of us can understand, there just seems to be a lack of will, a lack of political will, whatever you want to call it, for some big, powerful person to take up the gauntlet and say, enough's enough. We wouldn't let airplanes be crashing week in and week out. We wouldn't let nuclear power plants be melting down. I mean, the citizens would rise up. They'd be marching in the streets. They certainly wouldn't get on an airplane. But for some reason, I think it's kind of a self-protection mechanism for patients to say, I just can't believe that. I can't believe that the system is potentially unsafe because of the implications that would have for me. And I have to be able to trust that my doctor, my nurse, my hospital is safe. Because, what can little old me do about it anyway?
Right. Absolutely. And I think the airline industry is a great comparison. A lot of the safety measures that have been put in place in healthcare, like safety checklists, for example, has been modeled after what they had in place for airlines. But I agree. I think that we have worked, tirelessly for the last 10 years or so in regards to really being out there advocating, bringing awareness to system changes that are needed. But as you know, getting before legislators, has been very challenging and keeping their attention, especially with, the political climate, as it changes over the last, 10 years or so. But I do think that for patients, until it happens to them or a loved one, they can just, hopefully trust where they're at, that it's going to be safe. And a great majority of it is, as we said. And I would not want, the general public to be in panic mode thinking, oh my goodness, is it safe, and continuously question that and be fearful of going to get help or to get treatment because of that fear. But they rightfully need to be educated on how do they ensure that they're at least doing due diligence to make sure that they're going to a safe environment, and that the providers, that they're seeing and scheduling with have been, at least vetted appropriately by the organization. And then, of course, teaching them some due diligence they can do on their own. So,
well, it's interesting you would bring that up, because another conversation we were having is we haven't seen each other in a month. We have spoken and texted, but in that period of time, I've had a loved one in the emergency room. There are some people who were scheduled to be here today. One is battling cancer. One has a wife having surgery. There's just a lot of things. And you had your own little scare, which took you to the emergency room. And so it's just such a reminder of how vulnerable we all are. And I say vulnerable not to scare people, but if you've ever felt, no one has ever felt more vulnerable, I think, than when they're in a hospital.
Right. Absolutely. I completely agree. And, I made a comment in our last one about, it's really difficult when it's you or your loved one and you're in a new environment, being, and not where I work, where I don't know the physicians. And so being here in Texas, where I don't know the practitioners that I'm going to see. My sister's in Seattle, and she's having health, issues as well and undergoing surgery soon. And so trying to navigate that and make sure they're qualified and competent is a lot more challenging than it is for my normal professional life where, I know the providers and I have more information related to their outcomes. But here, as you know, I immediately called you and said, hey, like, this is what's going on. I need some treatment. Do you have anyone you would not recommend? Anyone that absolutely I should not go see? Because I know if you know their name, then, that's not a good thing typically. And so it is difficult, when you're in the general public, for anybody to really be able to dive in and make sure that you are getting quality care. But as we've talked about before, there are some things that they can do to vet physicians, but that's not always, and practitioners, that's not always going to mean that they absolutely are qualified and competent. But we do have to rely on hospitals to do their due diligence. And like I said, for the most part, there are great organizations out there that do their due diligence. They have regulatory bodies looking at them on a regular basis. And so.
Well, and it's also not a black and white necessarily that A hospital, bad, B hospital, good.
Yeah.
Good hospitals can be bad on any given shift, on any given day. And a bad hospital can somehow get it right, even though they've got a lot of problems. And, I can tell you in my own personal experience, from my own family members within the same hospital system in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. One, my brother-in-law, was in a beautiful, one of these hospitals where you're just like, oh, this is gorgeous, the marble floors, the Starbucks in the lobby or whatever. And thank God that I was there advocating for him. And the care that he received was horrific. And that's generally considered to be a good hospital, but for whatever reason, the care he received was horrible. Conversely, this prior weekend, a family member had to be rushed to the emergency room. Thank God everything turned out okay. The emergency room was filthy. They were overrun. The hospital was full. The emergency room was full. And so they had patients, including my family member, out in the gurneys in the hallway. The care was excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah. So, how can anybody tell? It's just a coin toss.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, I like you said, there's no, this hospital is bad, this one's good. You can't judge it by that. You don't know what's going on behind the scenes. There's a lot of good people who are trying to do great things and trying to provide quality care. Mm-hmm. And as in any industry, there's going to be breakdowns. And it's not, you can't pinpoint it to every organization. I mean, they could be doing their best due diligence and things can happen. And so it varies. I agree with you. And it can be scary. You can have, one of the things that I always tell people is they'll look at reviews and they'll say, oh, he has a horrible bedside manner. And I said, well, sometimes I'd rather have somebody with a bad bedside manner, but excellent, surgical skills.
Right.
Than somebody who's very, very nice, but may not have the best quality and clinical outcomes. And so, it's really hard to tell without really knowing and doing your due diligence. And so.
Well, I tell you, who knows? The nurses know.
Yeah, that's true. My sister's a nurse, so.
If you could just call up the nurses at any given facility, they'd say, oh, just avoid this doctor like the plague, or we love this doctor, we hate that doctor. But, also all the systems in the world, you could look at a hospital with great systems. They checked all the boxes. They passed their joint commission accreditation, because they came and checked and they had everything right. But other things can override that. Yeah. So I think of the last case I tried a few years ago. It became about the system, because what happened is a patient with a critical lab value the surgery should have been stopped. Instead, the surgery proceeded and he had a horrific outcome, as could be expected. But what happened is you dig. Mm-hmm. So you perform root cause analysis. I perform my own kind of root cause analysis. Like, how did this happen? This communication error, how did it happen? One of the ways that it happened is that even the forms, the pre-op forms, called for a surgical timeout. So you're supposed to have a timeout. Is it the right patient? Is it the right, let's check the wrist thing. Yes, this is Mr. Smith. Is it the right surgery? Is the right body part? All of these things. And they're supposed to say, any critical lab values or anything like that. So they had electronically documented. They had just gone through check, and, timeout, check. And the timeout was 1 second. So because they were entering it in real time, it took them a second to check the box or whatever. So at trial, as you can imagine, I may have gone a little over the top with this, but I was like, you can't even say time out in 1 second. You'd say time out in 1 second. You can't even say time out, much less conduct a timeout. So I had, this is what a timeout would normally do, or, this is what it would normally entail. This is how long it would normally take, 10 seconds, 15 seconds, or whatever. But what it came down to is the surgeon was also an owner of the hospital. All-powerful surgeons like chop, chop. We're running these people through here like an assembly line. We got to go, 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 go.
Yeah.
Don't need a timeout. That's just check the box. So anyway, I can't help myself going off on these long war stories, but it's just like you can do everything right. And I'm sure that frustrates hospitals sometimes. They're like, we did everything right, but we can't make sure everybody follows the rules all the time.
Right. And it can be absolutely frustrating. And, as a healthcare system, you can get ahead of things. You can do everything right. You can put all the safety nets in place, but you can't absolutely control individual behavior every single minute of every single day. So what health systems do is they have to have systems in place to educate, to get ahead of things, to monitor. But there's no perfection, in any profession. There's definitely not perfection in healthcare, but everybody can just do everything they can to have the safety measures in place, the education, and like I said, the oversight. But you can't control it, every individual behavior. So.
But it's also a culture thing. We've talked about culture so much because, when we get a choice about whether we decide to fly or not and which airline to fly, but you never see a pilot taking a shortcut on a pre-flight checklist because the pencil pushers are saying, chop, chop, we've got productivity. We got to keep these planes running. No. Safety first. And I think that's just at the root of so many of the problems. And it's a profit-driven business in most instances. There are pressures on the business people to make the business profitable, and oftentimes that means squeezing the producers of healthcare. I don't know, do you see that in your world? Maybe not with your institution, but others.
Right. I think we may have, of course, during our time knowing each other, we've talked about those organizations that unfortunately will put profit over patient safety. And yes, you're right. Sometimes like the example that you gave, that's extremely unfortunate, where it's a physician who owned the hospital, was part owner in the hospital and felt they could skirt the rules and there wasn't anybody holding them accountable. That's, definitely not what you want to see, of course, right? And so, like I said, you have to be able to, have the pencil pushers. I can be considered a pencil pusher that's doing the oversight and really just making sure that you can do everything you can to get ahead of it. I think, in the airline industry, for example, you're right. You have the pilot who is going to say, no, we have to go through the safety checklist. But do we really know every single pilot's doing that? How do we know they weren't having drinks the night before? So, it can be any industry. Yeah. And so, like I said, I think the only thing that hospitals and health systems can do is make sure the checks and balances are there and, have that oversight and not make exceptions for individuals, despite, their position of power. That's a struggle that, we've talked about in the past. And, there shouldn't be exceptions made. The standards should be upheld. The policy should be upheld. A consistency across the board. But, it is a business, of course they're going to try to meet quotas and so forth. But patient safety has to come first. So,
Yep. Well, I'll say this. Do I believe that the pilot is doing the pre-flight safety checklist each and every time thoroughly and precisely? I do. And the reason that I believe that is because if the plane goes down, the pilot goes down too.
true.
So,
That is true.
there's a little self-interest there. But there's just truly the healthcare providers themselves are also getting squeezed in so many different directions. Not by all. I always feel like I have to say that. Not by all. But health insurance companies are squeezing. They have to see more patients because the reimbursement rate is declining. So in order to make the same amount of money and pay their staff and all of that stuff, they're having to see more patients. Huge amount of paperwork. I think physicians report one of the major reasons that they're so burned out is there's so much paperwork intensity and burden. And then, doctors describe the bane of their existence is these health insurance companies that are like, well, doctor, you've recommended this, but we don't think so. We, the health insurance company, don't think the patient needs this, that, or the other, or maybe you should try this instead of that. So they're having to advocate with the patient's health insurance company to care for the patient. And then nurses are getting squeezed by some hospitals because the hospitals are trying to drive up the profits, and they're requiring nurses to care for more patients than what is safe. And so, like a lot of things, what I'm hoping in my lifetime, in our lifetimes, is that people inside the system are going to rise up and say, enough is enough. We got into this profession to help people, and the system is not letting us do that. And so we have a vested interest in changing it. Not a ragtag group of patient safety advocates,
Right.
honestly.
Well, the one thing I will say, at least in my experience, especially now, is that is happening. There are these great programs out there in regards to really empowering the staff to their safety protocols and reporting tools they are able to report negative, or poor outcomes, safety issues, poor, behavior or conduct issues directly, and they have policies and procedures in place that protect them, from any form of retaliation and so forth. Does it happen everywhere? I can't speak for other organizations because I know that we've heard some that, there is some retaliation, but I've seen amazing systems. I won't brag about certain ones, but I have seen amazing systems out there who really focus on patient safety. That is their culture. They lead with patient safety being at the forefront of everything that they do. And so when they empower their employees to speak up and they empower them to say, we have a culture of patient safety, come to us, tell us, like, what are you seeing out on the floors? What can we do better? How can we improve? And you have that partnership between everyone, your clinical staff, your administrative staff, then that's where you see, healthcare really improve and your patient safety ratings go up, and it's data driven. And so when you're able to really look at those systems over time, and when you put those processes in place and those procedures in place, and you can watch those numbers and that data, it's amazing to watch, just how, well those programs work and how the safety significantly improves when you empower, the staff to do that. And, I think we spoke about a system, not to pick on Texas, but here in Texas, where the staff didn't feel empowered to be able to do that.
Right.
And they felt, it's not that they felt, they were retaliated against by speaking up and speaking out against, not having enough staffing on the floor. And then, being pressured into seeing more patients they felt was appropriate for the staffing letter, a staffing in their unit, or speaking out against, physicians they felt were not qualified or so forth. And we've seen the retaliation happen. And so those are the organizations where, as somebody who's been a consultant for, 25 plus years, it makes me want to come help them because there's just so much that they could be doing to help improve that. And it starts with having a culture of safety.
They have to have the will to do it.
Absolutely.
And, you and I have talked about this particular hospital system, and it's crazy. It reminds me of the stories that nurses and doctors have told me, and this is a bad system.
Yeah.
A bad system. The nurses had a way of charting that was their secret code language for this particular doctor. And they would say, per Dr. So-and-so, call to clarify order for aspirin in a patient with a history of blood clots. Per Dr. So-and-so says heparin, not necessary, will not order. And they're documenting that for their own protection to say, we know this patient has a history of blood clots. The patient's immobilized postoperatively. I'm a nurse. I know well enough to know I should be starting a heparin drip to thin the blood to reduce the risk of this patient having a fatal blood clot or non-fatal blood clot. And the same group of nurses talking about the same doctor said to me, we have been trying for years to get this doctor stopped, but they won't listen to us. We're just nurses. Then they finally got a supportive doctor to document all of the cases, go to the administration, and I don't know what the current status of this situation is, other than that doctor was told, be careful. Watch your own self, because this person, the bad doctor, is a very powerful person. And that doctor, when that doctor found out that people were complaining about him, he went on a retaliation campaign and said, I will hunt down, I will find whoever's saying this, about me, and da-da-da. And it's just like,
yeah,
you can't have that.
It's intimidation, and again, that's what you're describing as a system that's not, one, protecting their employees, not prioritizing patient safety, because that creates a hostile work environment, clearly, and not empowering their staff to speak up. And I think one thing that we have heard in some of these cases was where the nurses flat out say, this isn't safe and I'm not doing it. If you want to fire me, but I'm not putting my license at risk, and I'm not going to put patients at risk. I'm not going to be a part of this. I've seen residents, override an attending and say, I'm going to escalate this because I don't agree with this and it's not safe. Yeah. And so I think it's really unfortunate when you do have situations like that, where you have a hospital that is protecting and allowing that type of behavior, who aren't listening to the nurses or the frontline staff that are there on the day-to-day basis, because once again, that's putting profit over patient safety. That's allowing a hostile work environment. When in all reality, if they would put patient safety first,
right,
they would have less malpractice. They would have better patient safety outcomes, because, if you focus on patient safety first, then the rest will fall into place. So,
exactly. And it's easy for us to say, because, that, well, doctors ought to speak up, not fear retaliation. Nurses should speak up, not fear retaliation, because, they're, in most instances, relying on their job to pay their mortgage, and, That's their livelihood.
Yeah.
But, you know, what I would tell my children is doing the right thing is always the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
And like I say, easy for us to say, but nurses and doctors, please find the courage to do the right thing, because you're the ones that can fix it.
Right. Absolutely. And it's difficult because that's their livelihood.
Yep.
You know, it is their livelihood to be able to, of course, they have, you know, bills like all of us, you know, they have, you know, responsibilities, but at the same time, they, you know, can be very conflicted because they're put in a position where they themselves, you know, don't feel comfortable. They're putting their own license at risk. And so, you know, I agree. I say it's very hard. As we know, we're both friends with Bob Henderson, and
Yeah.
he's very vocal, and he said, you know, what could go wrong, you know, if I'm just going to tell the truth, but we've seen what can go wrong.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's very unfortunate when you hear about environments such as that, and that, you know, they don't prioritize, you know, their employees and their needs, and make sure they're in a protected environment. So,
Well, you know, Texas, for all the things that Texas doesn't do right when it comes to patient safety, having some of the harshest tort reform in the United States,
yes,
which hurts patients.
it does.
They're one of 2 states that has a safe harbor law for nurses.
Mm-hmm.
So nurses can report, and if they follow the steps that are in the safe harbor law, they have protection, legal protection from being retaliated against.
Mm-hmm.
And I think most nurses are aware of that.
Yeah.
But I will say one thing about the Duntsch cases is at every facility, well, in his residency and every facility where he ever operated, no one who should have come forward came forward that we know of. Mm-hmm. Certainly not publicly, certainly not in the medical malpractice litigation. When we're trying to talk to them, say, you know, we know you were there, what'd you see? You know, didn't see a thing.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I feel like more often than not, it's the code of silence, and just keep your head down, and it's not your problem. But that hurts patients.
It does.
Bottom line.
And speaking of tort reform,
Yes.
why don't we touch on that for a second in Texas tort reform?
Okay.
Reform.
Yes.
When you said that, you know, my ears immediately perked up, because this is something I've harped on for years in regards to exactly how that reform here in Texas truly does harm patients.
Yes.
Do you want to speak to that a little bit from your perspective?
How long have you got? Oh.
Till our next topic.
And do you have a Kleenex?